Zed is not the first person to find himself lost in no man's land, and not the first person to try and answer that question of where do I belong through his creativity. And yes, though there may not be a simple answer to that question, there is a tradition of turning those scars into a kind of roadmap to your creativity and a roadmap to creating your own answer to where do I belong.
Welcome to Script Apart, a podcast about the first draft secrets of great movies. Each episode, a brilliant screenwriter revisits their initial screenplay for what became a beloved movie, discussing what changed, what didn't, and why. From first draft to the big screen. On today's special bonus episode, we're joined by the ludicrously talented Riz Ahmed. Riz is not only an award-winning actor known for roles in films like Four Lions, Nightcrawler, Sound of Metal and Rogue One: A Star Wars Story, he's also a gifted musician and a prominent voice for change in the film industry, frequently advocating for a more diverse range of stories and storytellers. Last year he added screenwriter to that lengthy list of talents with the mesmerising Mogul Mowgli, a dark drama about a British-Pakistani rapper who suffers the sudden onset of a debilitating autoimmune disease. Zed, played by Ahmed, is a talented MC hungry for fame but growing disconnected from his roots when illness sends him spiralling into a string of dangerous hallucinations, stalked every step of the way by a mysterious masked figure with links to Pakistan's past. Co-written with director Bassam Tariq, the film won critical acclaim for its intimacy, imagination and vast ambition, innovatively weaving in songs from an accompanying concept album that Riz released roughly in tandem with the movie. In this episode, he tells us about his relationship with writing and the parts of his own life that he brought to the screen in this deeply personal tale. We also talk about the film's prescient echoes of the COVID-19 pandemic and why our scars can be a roadmap to our creativity, as Riz so beautifully puts it. Do make sure you've seen Mogul Mowgli before listening in, as this is a spoiler-filled conversation exploring every one of the movie's major plot points. Once you have, come back and brace yourself for a fascinating insight into what, for my money, is one of the most unique films of the past 12 months. Before we dive into the conversation, a quick reminder that if you want to support the show, you can do so by rating and reviewing us in Apple Podcasts, or better yet, by joining us on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/scriptapart, where for the price of a single monthly cup of coffee, you can get access to the first issue of our brand new magazine, as well as a ton of other perks. Okay, that's the promotional stuff out the way. Let's get into my conversation with the amazing Riz Ahmed. A huge thank you to our Patreon supporters, that includes Max Meriner and Jeff McDonald. You're listening to Script Apart, hosted by me, Al Horner, produced by Camille Demek. Riz, so great to have you with us. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Glad to hear it. I'm so excited to chat about Mogul Mowgli with you. I've been deeply haunted by this movie ever since I saw it. It's a movie that knits together so many of the talents in your arsenal as a performer and a storyteller, Riz. To watch it felt like a culmination of all these different strands of your creativity that we've seen developing over the last decade or so. Did it feel like that to make the film?
Oh, that's really kind of you to say. I mean, you know, it's really strange because when you kind of look back on a project after it's finished, you can make sense of it retrospectively, and you can kind of, it almost seems more calculated than it is. And actually what was really liberating and inspiring about this process and this creative process was that we didn't overthink it. You know, we actually just kind of created from the heart. We tried to create from a very honest place. And I think when you try and create in that way, you end up probably drawing a more honest portrait of yourself and where you're at emotionally than you would if you tried to plan it. You know, that's not to say that we didn't kind of spend a lot of time, you know, breaking and re-breaking stories and writing and rewriting scenes, or, you know, even on set. But there wasn't a kind of, hey, let's step back, big picture. How are we going to weave in this theme that we're interested in and this storyline that we're super, excited to share, or this element of what I can do as a performer? It was just a lot more organic than that. And when you step back and look at it, you go, that's actually a pretty accurate snapshot of kind of where we were at as creators at that moment.
All instinctive. That's really interesting. It's one of the things I love about it is it's not strictly a horror movie. It refuses to be pinned down to any one genre, in fact, but it does fall into a horror tradition of using an exterior threat or change as the kind of physical manifestation of something interior in its main character. So the way that The Babadook was this manifestation of grief, the way that John Carpenter's The Thing was this literalization of Cold War paranoia and mistrust. In Mogul Mowgli, you have an autoimmune disease, Balia, that's the perfect metaphor for what Zed is experiencing. I think you described it once as an identity crisis played out on a molecular level. What was so fascinating about that idea to you?
Well, it's interesting because it's interesting to hear you describe it as a kind of in that horror mold, because, we sometimes joke and say it's kind of a Sufi comedy horror musical drama. It is kind of has this hybridity to it, which I would think that Bassam Tariq as a filmmaker brings to everything he does. He has a hyphenated identity, as do I, and bringing that kind of almost a sense of mongrelhood to his work, and its tone, I think is something that he does brilliantly. But it's interesting because I don't know, with how do you dramatize something as potentially heady and as abstract as an identity crisis, And, I think quite early on we were playing around with this idea of, a life-changing event that's out of your control that kind of forces you to have a perspective shift, even if, it drags you kicking and screaming by the scruff of your neck to take on that shift in perspective. And, I know, like, Bassam and I drew a lot from the experiences of people around us, our own experiences, and we started kind of digging into this idea of autoimmunity, and it was kind of fascinating because I think people from ethnic minorities are much more likely to suffer from autoimmune conditions, and there's different theories behind that. And one of them is that your ancestors lived in a different climate, had a different diet. Our bodies are still adjusting after hundreds of thousands of years and being one part of the world. Another is minority stress theory, was this idea that you're in a constant state of low-level kind of paranoia or hypervigilance, because society is communicating to you that you're part of the out group. And there's another theory, which is, I guess, a bit more spiritual and but ties in somewhat with, people like Deepak Chopra and other kind of like well-being kind of writers talk about, which is that it's about state of mind. And it's this idea that, we're at war with ourselves, we're attacking ourselves. And I just thought it would be a really interesting kind of way to examine this idea of self-hate or not loving yourself or not knowing who you are. So given that, we don't know what causes autoimmune conditions, I thought it was kind of quite rich territory to reflect, like you said, what the character was going through. And Zed, he's on that journey of trying to, he's been trying to kind of find himself in the validation of others. And actually what he's forced to do is sit still and face himself. In many ways, it's a kind of pandemic movie before the pandemic. He's in a kind of lockdown where he has to sit with his demons and work out who he is when he's not able to lose himself and run away from himself through work.
That's a description that could have also applied to Sound of Metal. So I'm curious to know, was there something on your mind? Were you contemplating any one in particular thing that drew you towards two projects almost simultaneously that deal with a connected subject matter?
Yeah, it's crazy how things work, but the answer is no. You're thinking about a certain topic. Bassam and I are thinking about this film, we're writing and we're sending pages back and forth. And then this other film comes along, which by rights, I should probably have said, no, thank you. I'm working on a project that deals with a musician who's going through this kind of illness that makes him change his perspective. But it was just too good. I thought, this filmmaker's too cool. I really vibe with him. And actually this script is incredible. And there's also a kind of big challenge there with the learning sign language and drumming, which would push me out of my head and into my body in a way that I thought would just be interesting process-wise. So I kind of took it on. And, really what I realized is that even though on paper they sound like really similar films, I mean, they're just so different. Yeah. The way they're executed, the characters, the feeling, the tone of the film, the central thesis and message of the film. They're really both very kind of unique filmmakers, and they've approached this, seemingly similar subject matter in such distinctive ways. And I guess for me as well, it's also a kind of bit of a lesson that, you can try and pin down who a character is on paper, but when you get under their skin, it's a different kettle of fish. And for me, inhabiting Rubin or inhabiting Zed, which is really, really different experiences.
And you mentioned the thesis of the movie there. How do you articulate the message of Mogul Mowgli?
I don't know if you do. I've set myself up for a trap that I'm going to slowly back away from.
That's fair enough.
I mean, I guess it's it delves into some themes that I think are very universal, which is about, in some ways, a story of the prodigal son. Of we will try and find ourselves out there in the world, but maybe what we're looking for has been right under our noses the whole time. Maybe what we've been looking for is, to some extent, also what we've been running away from. I guess it deals with that. It deals with themes of inheritance, how we inherit the gifts and the curses of the generations before us, how we're destined to kind of slip into the same patterns, and, we all end up becoming our parents in some level. And I guess in the broad sense, I would just say it's an exploration, it's a conversation between art and identity. How does your identity fuel your art, and how does your art fuel your identity? Because on some level, yes, you might think, this is who I am, so I'm going to make work about it, I'm going to express that. But actually, in expressing it, you're creating yourself, you're creating your identity, and ultimately the answer to the question, who am I and where do I belong, is an answer that can only be given through creativity. Identity is a creative act. And so I guess it can be something quite scary about not knowing where you fit in, not knowing where you belong. But there's also something there's an tremendous potential in that blank canvas. And so I guess, it's dealing with some of those topics and themes. But in terms of what his central thesis is, I don't know. I hope everyone walks away with something slightly different. In a personal way to everyone.
That's interesting. And you mentioned, if I can just wind back to something you said a few moments ago, you mentioned it was a hard story to break. You had to break and re-break this story. What were some of the ideas you explored that didn't end up making the finished film along the way? Were there different iterations of Mogul Mowgli before you ended up with the story that we know and love now?
Well, I mean, the answer is yes. There's a ton of stuff that didn't make it into the movie in the end. Look, it's this story about an artist who wants to who's very ambitious and wants to go out there and do his thing and find success. And his health takes a downturn, and he is stuck at home, the place he's been trying to run away from, the place that he avoids going, the place he's finally forced to, face is where he's from. And, on a personal level, his parents, and on a spiritual level, himself. And all these demons he's been running away from. That seems like a pretty straightforward film, but you can take that in so many different directions in terms of what are those demons, in terms of how much is it about his dad as opposed to facing himself, or the place he's from, or his cousins. So there was a lot of stuff that we kind of trimmed out of it. But I guess one of the biggest elements of the film that is not in the film is all the dream sequences were going to be in Pakistan.
Really?
Yeah, this idea of where you're from. We kind of thought, well, actually, if the roots of his failed ambition are kind of, familial, and if the roots of his illness are kind of in trauma and ancestral trauma, which is another big thing we look at, in the film, this field of epigenetics is really growing now. This idea that actually you might have diabetes because your great great grandmother was starved on a slavery plantation, and so your genes are still trying to hold on to all the sugar they can. This idea that trauma affects our bodies. It's actually a brilliant book by Bessel van der Kolk called "The Body Keeps the Score," which is kind of on that topic. But we were going to go back to DNA because that's the source of his DNA, to Pakistan, because that's the source of his DNA. That's the scene of the crime. It's where partition happened. It's where some ancestral traumas went down, and it's an attempt to reconnect to who he really is. And then we realized, Bassam and I actually went to Pakistan. We did a research trip there, and we were like, this is an amazing place, but this isn't where we're from, actually. And the answer to where you're from is it's a tricky answer to give. So I wrote that rap trying to explain where I'm from. And that rap is in the film, and it's from a kind of no man's land. It's a kind of in-between space. And actually we realized that all of these dream sequences need to take place in a limbo, in a kind of alternate reality, in a kind of imagined space that's like an in-between space. And that totally changed what was happening. There was this whole other kind of thriller plot line in the Pakistan flashbacks, but it became something else, something much more personal.
You do still manage to kind of get in some of that historical weight that we all carry around with us, especially Zed. The opening scene, before we actually meet Zed, we begin with moonlight through trees and the sound of a train chugging through the night. It's a motif that kind of ends up running through the movie, revealing more of what's happening each time. Can you tell me about what we end up seeing on that train, its historical importance, and how it ends up corresponding with Zed's story?
Yeah, well, I guess I'm on one level, I don't want to give too much away or say too much for people who go on to see the film, but...
Oh, this is a spoiler podcast, so we can...
Okay, really? Okay.
Yeah, you're all good, man.
Let's dig into it.
Let's go.
Well, it's a story of partition, Partition was when India and Pakistan were kind of carved into two countries by the British as they were leaving in a very kind of frantic and rushed way, leaving the subcontinent after a couple of 100 years of ruling the Indian subcontinent. And, up to about 2 million people died in partition. It's the largest forced migration in human history. Hundreds of thousands, millions of people going in these two directions, and something really disturbing started happening. There was a lot of just a lot of violence, a lot of rioting between Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs at that time. And you had a lot of Muslims traveling west to Pakistan from India, a lot of Hindus and Sikhs traveling east to India, where, when they found their homes suddenly becoming part of Pakistan, just now a Muslim country. And these trains would arrive on the other side of the border, just full of dead bodies. These trains would be sabotaged en route, set on fire. Everyone on there would kill, men, women, and children. So you had these kind of ghost trains arriving. And the idea really is that, Zed's father carries this trauma of partition. The trauma of actually being a kid stuck on one of those trains, hiding underneath used British military kind of clothing, a stack of clothing. This is actually a story from Bassam's family, just surrounded by all these dead bodies and dead relatives. This is something that would have happened to lots of people. And so he carries that trauma, and that trauma is one of, where do I belong? Of being stuck in this endless no man's land. And so his father carries that trauma in his DNA, and he passes it on to Zed, who kind of, that trauma finds expression through, as I said, this identity crisis being played out on a molecular level. Who am I? Where do I belong? The body doesn't recognize itself, so the body attacks itself. But that trauma of displacement has also been experienced by Toba Tek Singh, who's a Qawwali singer. Qawwali is this traditional kind of South Asian music. It's kind of like gospel jazz. It's kind of spiritual, but also kind of punk. And this character, Tobatek Singh, he kind of takes this displacement and he says he makes art from it. He creates an identity out of it. He says he lives in the no man land. He's kind of planted his seeds in those in the kind of fractures that have opened up between East and West, India, Pakistan, us and them. That's where people like me live. And so, as well as there being this kind of inheritance of a curse, there's also the inheritance of a gift, and the gift is the creative act, you know. And what we realize is that Zed is not the first person to find himself lost in no man's land, and not the first person to try and answer that question of where do I belong through his creativity. And yes, though there may not be a simple answer to that question, there is a tradition of turning those scars into a kind of roadmap to your creativity and a roadmap to, you know, creating your own answer to where do I belong. So that's how, you know, Partition kind of bequeaths these kind of scars, but also an invitation to kind of create your own sense of belonging to Zed.
Scars becoming a roadmap into your creativity is a really nice way of leading us into the next question. We then meet Zed doing what he does best, on stage in front of a screaming crowd, bearing his soul, performing these rhymes that speak to his dual identity as a British Muslim. His hunger for success in these early scenes makes what happens to him all the more brutal. I'm curious to know, Riz, like, who was Zed to you, and what parts of his journey did you pull from your own life to write? Like, where did Zed start and Riz begin?
It's deliberately very blurry, you know. It's something that Bassam Tariq, my co-writer and our director, pushed me to do. It was very uncomfortable for me to kind of take personal elements from my life or from my family or from, and burning ambition and devastating disappointment that is the roller coaster ride of a creative life, and to put that on screen. But yeah, in short, I guess it's heavily drawn from my life and also Bassam's life. You know, this idea that you wanna be a success because you want to represent your people and you want to make stuff better for them, but also because you kind of want to escape that place. You know, I'm on tour, never seeing my family at all, but it's for them. Or Bassam saying, I'm out here making this film, but it's all for you, it's for my kids and for my wife. How often do you see them actually? You know, it's about that kind of bind, you know, and that's something that's definitely was personal to me, to Bassam, to lots of other kind of creatives that we know that feel that burden of representation, but also the claustrophobia where they're from. You know, the place that they were from isn't a place that tried to make their creative life possible in some ways. But their creative life wouldn't be possible without it. It's the barriers become the inspiration. So what do? You have to keep in touch with those barriers. They inspire you, but if you get too close, they'll trap you.
Yeah, we see that again in that scene. So it's a wonderful scene at that family gathering. Another character is chastising Zed for calling himself that instead of his real name, Zahir, implying it's some sort of betrayal. And we also see him in that scene kind of seem to dissociate himself from his heritage a bit, listening to a bit of a cassette of Pakistani music before turning it off dismissively. How do you describe that tension within Zed, and what did you want to explore by writing that conflict into his character?
Yeah, well, I guess it was what I was just touching on now, which is that, you know, the obstacles can often be the inspiration. So you need to kind of keep in touch with some of those obstacles. You need to keep in touch with where you're from. But where you're from can also be an obstacle in itself, you know, and those obstacles can kind of box you in and trap you a little bit. So I think at the start of the film, he's kind of claims to be representing his people, his culture, but really a lot of what he's doing is driven by ego, and it's really about him. And it's, it's that dismissal of, as you said, Qawwali music, or that just pure frustration with the kind of messiness of home. And what we kind of get to later on is a kind of acceptance of it, you know. What we get to at the end is Zed actually kind of writes a rap song that is inspired by that Qawwali singer. Zed chooses, you know, not to go on tour, to put his health first and put in that family time to heal physically, but also just for them to both heal, you know. And there is that, you know, that sequence at the end, which I would describe as healing, which strangely, you know, was unscripted and we didn't know how to end the movie. So we kind of improvised that.
Oh, wow. So what were some of the like stand-in endings for the film that you originally had in the script?
To be honest, we knew that we needed to end it, you know, after Zed kind of makes that long walk down that metaphorical corridor, with some kind of homecoming, but whether that was back on stage and back on tour, so you have that kind of circular structure, and you end up with him performing in front of a crowd, but in what way is he different? That was one question. Another one was, do you just end it in the kind of no man's land? You know, is that home actually? Do we end it in a dream sequence? Do we end it in a kind of space we're not sure where it is? We had a kind of sequence actually that was scripted but never, and we shot it as well but didn't make it in the end, which was within his kind of dreamscape. He goes and he finds Toba Tek Singh, the Qawwali singer, and who's kind of dead. You know, if Toba Tek Singh is a kind of metaphorical sickness of not knowing who you are, he finds that, you know, that sickness has been slain, and he kind of goes and approaches him, and he kind of lifts the veil of who's there. And in a reference to the classic, you know, Sufi story, The Conference of the Birds, we're thinking maybe he lifts the veil and who he sees is himself. You know, we got rid of that. Then we also shot an alternate ending where within that dreamscape he finds Toba Tek Singh, and then RPG, who's a younger rapper that Zed is so scared will replace him at the start of the film. By the end of the film, he understands that he's just a link in a chain, and he happily passes on his music to him. That Zed takes off the Mughal style kind of robe that his hospital gown has transformed into, and gives it to RPG, almost kind of like crowning him and saying, you know what, like, I inherited this mess and now it's yours. You know, good luck. So there was that ending. In the end, we just thought, nah, let's just ground it. Like practically what would happen next? I don't know, it might be quite boring. You know, dude's at home, he's sick, like what he's recovering. And we just kind of realized actually, you know, at heart, this film isn't about all these abstract ideas. At its heart, it's a father-son story, and we need to end it with that moment of connection. So we were there in a studio with an hour left to shoot. We had the bathroom set. It was quick to put up. And we were like, all right, how about I'm taking a dump and dad comes in and we have a chat. It'll be like that, a callback to the hospital scene. How it will be different, I don't know. I just started chanting the rap. And we just kind of went into it. You know, Ali started chanting back, and there was this moment of, okay, these two guys that have been scarred by a sense of displacement and not knowing where they belong are now healing themselves and each other through this song, this art, this response they've created to displacement, this anthem about displacement. You know, it's taking from the Qawwali singer Toba Tek Singh, but he's turned it into his own kind of contemporary rap. So it's bridging that divide, and it's trying to heal that scar. And it's ultimately just about them kind of connecting, you know?
Yeah, it's the perfect place to wrap things up thematically, and a beautiful way to leave that character. You seem to have really enjoyed writing this movie, Riz. What does that mean for you now? Like going forward, having been having written Mogul Mowgli and presumably been emboldened by its success, is writing going to be like a bigger and bigger part of what you do? Do you think you might start to kind of juggle that more and more with acting gigs, or how do you think it's going to play out?
I guess the more I write, the more I realize just how challenging it is. And I guess for me, it's not so much about specifically writing or directing or producing or acting. It's like what I enjoy most is the collaboration. And sometimes a collaboration will be one around writing. Sometimes it will be as a producer. Sometimes it will be as an actor. But I think what Mogul Mowgli really encouraged me to do was to find those collaborators who you can really be vulnerable with and who you can really understand, and they understand you, and to just open yourself to collaboration in that way. I think I didn't leave that going, wait, well, we won a screenwriting award. I'm a great screenwriter. No, I thought, man, I'm so lucky to have Bassam as a collaborator, and collaboration really, it draws something out of you, that maybe you might not draw out of yourself if you were left to your own devices. So I guess in terms of what the future looks like, I would love to kind of continue to find my collaborators, my tribe, and work with them. And I think that's what these last couple of years have been about for me, finding Bassam and working with him, finding Darius and just finding him as such a kindred spirit, and us working together. And with Michael Pearce's film, Encounter, that's coming up soon. Just that personal connection, I think, is what I value the most.
Yeah. It must be hard prioritizing. I mean, especially off the back of your Oscar nomination earlier this year. You're such an in-demand actor. You did Venom, you made a Star Wars movie. You could easily settle into a career of acting in blockbuster movies if you chose. But you also seem to have a commitment to telling your own more intimate stories and impacting the culture that way. I'm curious to know, Riz, how are you kind of working out which opportunities to take advantage of? And is the hope one day to be able to kind of marry those two disparate things I just mentioned? Like, could we one day start to see like Riz Ahmed written blockbuster movies that have the budget of a Venom, but that allow you to write with the intimacy and cultural specificity of a movie like this one?
It's a great idea. Let's go talk to the studios right now.
I'll call them now.
Hype man, let's get this movie. That sounds great. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think that dichotomy, in some senses, things have never been more disparate. You've got like kind of these entertainment spectacles, these thrill ride movies, and these franchises, and then you also have like, these incredible, smaller, more intimate stories that actually, very rarely make it to the cinema now even. But in other ways, I think we are seeing a convergence. I think we're seeing bigger films that have more to say and a lot of heart and are trying to be brave and bold. And I think we're seeing kind of first-time filmmakers and indie filmmakers being given bigger budgets than they ever would have before in the streaming age. So it's kind of interesting, like I'm not sure where things will go, but I don't know, just something that in terms of how I try and filter, what I should do and how I can contribute, I just think, does it stretch me and does it stretch the culture? And sometimes one will mean the other, and sometimes actually, it's just one. But ideally, you kind of have both, and that's something that I'm really trying to kind of build out with my production company, Left-Handed Films. It's Left-Handed. It's about being unorthodox and flipping the script and going left field, really, and just trying to put stories out there that maybe we just haven't seen before. And if it's something that's maybe impacting the culture because it's new, it's probably also going to be something that pushes me out of my comfort zone. I think often, ideally, performances that is the experience of the actor and the audience going on the same emotional journey, right? And if something's pushing me out of my comfort zone, it's probably pushing the audience out of their comfort zone as well. So where those two meet is, I guess, where I try and look.
That's the sweet spot. Well, Riz, this has been so much fun, man. Thank you so much for coming on Script Apart.
Thank you. It's an absolute honor. And thanks so much for support. And
See you soon, Riz. Thanks so much. You've been listening to Script Apart, hosted by me, Al Horner, produced by Camille Demek. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.